Well, Mel, great to connect here. I know you've got lots of experience working with clients all over the world, helping them reshape their health. But I want to know your story and how you got into natural health to begin with.
Sure. Yeah, there's sort of two phases to it. The first is, I mean, like a lot of people who find themselves in natural health, I had my own health problems that I was struggling to resolve the kind of tried and true ways. And it culminated with me going to India after college. And when I was there volunteering for 6 months. And when I was there, I contracted amoebic dysentery. And it was not treated properly. So I was kind of in and out of hospital and doing all these things, taking all these antibiotics. The long story short is that I ended up developing a chronic infection. So for 2 years, I had dysentery, which I do not recommend. And so I really had to figure out how I was going to get well. And it was tricky, really. And I was going to industrial medicine. And it was around that time that I was working with a Chinese medicine practitioner and realized that it was really helpful and also with nutrition because my digestion it wasn't great as a kid but it was trashed at this point. And so I really had to figure out the kind of the wheat, separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of dietary advice because most things I ate made me sick and I had to go lie down. So that was how I ended up studying Chinese medicine, and then I went for a second degree in nutrition and functional medicine and combined those for quite a while very happily. And then the kind of the next phase of it was that when I was living in the UK for about 8 years, and when I moved back to the States overnight, my system crashed. Like I woke up and I could barely wash the dishes. My whole body hurt. I had no, and it was like someone had pulled the plug. And because of my previous experience and my clinical training and my clinical experience, I was like, we will figure this out. It's going to be okay. Like we will figure this out. You have all the best tools. And I'm now 7 years later, and I can say I'm healthy again, but it's taken me all of those 7 years to kind of try more of what I already knew and that not working too well, and then retraining and learning basically new ways of dealing with the reality of people who are sick in modern times, where it's very complex and it's not often as simple as simply changing your diet or finding the mold. It's really, and when it is that simple, that's great. Sometimes it is, but for me, it was like, okay, my starting point was with a decent diet and a clean environment and knowing how to meditate, and none of that was good enough. So it prompted me to learn a lot of neurology, developmental neurology, to completely retrain in Chinese medicine, really focus on first principles, and to train in how to work with real people in the real world who have lots of things going on.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, with chronic illness today, it is complex. A lot of people want to think, I mean, we want to simplify it. A lot of people want to think it's just make some dietary changes, address potential nutrient deficiencies, right? And something simple like that, sleep better. And for many people, they do get better when they do that. But there's a lot of these complex chronic illnesses out there that they've been working on that. They've been trying that, and they're just not seeing, the results, and they're still struggling and suffering. And you really have to unwrap. It's almost like unwrapping an onion, right? And so you got to really get to the root causes and figure out what's going on. I know in functional medicine we say, if there's 5 nails in somebody's foot and we pull out 3 of them, they still have foot pain, right? And there's still
Right.
2 nails. Technically, they've gotten better, right? We remove 3 of them, but they don't feel any better. And so that's one of the big things. And now you have your first principles. Let's talk about that. Where you start when it comes to these complex chronic illnesses.
Yeah, well, the first principles it's interesting. It's a lot of the understanding comes from looking at Chinese medicine because Chinese medicine is basically describing first principles. And they're not kind of specific to Chinese medicine because they just exist, whether you acknowledge them or not. And a lot of them come from looking at nature because we are part of nature. And I don't mean that in a sort of hippy dippy kind of way. I mean, we just are, that's where we come from. And so by understanding fundamentals, we can really separate, what's working well from what's not working well. So for example, if you have 5 nails in your foot and you take out 3 of them and you feel the same, how do you know that you're 3/5 of the way there versus just going in the wrong direction? If you feel the same, we need better ways of getting feedback. So a lot of the first principles really come from things that you can observe yourself just by looking out your window. The analogy I usually make is like, um, I know people in my life who are really great gardeners. And so they can go out, let's say, into my backyard and look with their eyes, and they know a lot about what they would plant and what they would not plant. They can see where the sun's going. They can see where it's draining. They know where we are, so they know about the rain levels. And they would get all that information really just by looking. And if you don't know anything about gardening or horticulture or nature, you'd be like, how did you do that? Like, what kind of witchcraft is this? But it really is just a learned skill of kind of simple observation that pretty much anyone can do. And we can do this with, I encourage everyone to learn this skill for themselves because, functional medicine is great in many ways in terms of the improvements that it makes on the industrial medicine model. Like, this is really good. There can often still be maybe perhaps too much of an emphasis on the microscopic. Sometimes that microscopic information coming from lab tests can be very helpful. Sometimes we can get over focused on it. So if we go back to our garden, if I forget about what I can see with my eyes and only do a soil sample and base all of my decisions on that, I'm probably not going to do too well in my gardening adventure here. So the same thing with people, you can look at your complexion, what's like growing on your tongue. What does your poop look like or smell like, or how does it come out? How often do you do it? What does your pee look like? If you're not sleeping well, tell me more about that. Are you waking up in the middle of the night? Are you having trouble falling asleep? And all of this is giving us kind of very clear information about the ecosystem that we're working with. And when we work with people on that level, we can often have a lot more leverage than when we work with like individual nutrients. And so these first principles are looking at things like, light, dark, damp versus dry, hot versus cold. That's kind of the basics of it, and like kind of gases, air stuff. So it's cool because it's very much backed up in the literature. It explains very well what we see on a lab, but we don't always have to go to the lab to get that information. We can see a lot of that information with our eyes.
So you like to start with kind of a Chinese medicine approach, looking at different body types or different doshas, I think it's called. I don't know if that's Ayurveda or Chinese medicine or if I'm getting that wrong. But you're kind of looking at putting people into kind of groups of characteristics.
Yeah, that's right. So dosha is from Ayurveda, but we've got
Yeah.
similar ideas in Chinese medicine. I mean, even like something kind of simple, like for example, one question that I ask people when they're coming in, kind of clinically starting a process is it easier for you to gain weight or lose weight? Right? Uh, and so not to say that that tells me every single thing about them, but
Hmm.
this is like a large, broad brush type of question that tells me that kind of in general, your body decides to do different things under stress or under certain nutrient requirements that would suggest that you may want a different approach. Right. And not that we don't pin everything on that one question, but it's just one idea that when you're looking when we're talking about things like inflammation, it doesn't differentiate those people. A lot of these questions that we have, don't differentiate something as simple as that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And you're looking at their tongue and you're looking at different characteristics about them and around them.
Yeah, and I'm teaching them how to look at their own tongue, which is
Mm,
really cool because,
yeah.
again, we don't want to hyper focus on anything, but if someone can see that when they eat certain foods, for example, they get kind of like frosting on their tongue, and that's connected to them feeling like garbage.
Mm,
Now, and they know what to do about that. Then now, I mean, this is really helpful. This is very, very useful, and it's very empowering.
yeah, for sure. Now, you talked earlier about brain development and how a lot of these issues can start in early childhood as the brain is developing. Can you go into that in more detail?
Sure. And this is multifaceted. This is like one of my many like aha moments in the last, that second part of my journey, um, where you know, during that time, I considered myself pretty knowledgeable about treating autoimmune conditions. I'd had autoimmune conditions, I'd treated plenty, and I considered myself knowledgeable. And I was studying neurological development with Dr. Robert Malillo, who I would say is like probably the
Yeah,
foremost expert
I know Dr.
in the
Robert.
world. And in one of his lectures, he mentioned the fact that the left hemisphere of the brain, like of the cortex, amps up the immune system and the inflammatory response, and the right hemisphere calms it down and dampens it down. And I was like, how am I today years old with two master's degrees, having treated all these people and not knowing, like, that's a foundational aspect of how our system is working. This isn't like just like kind of this minor detail that you might pull out at a pub quiz. This is really important. And I thought, oh my gosh, like I don't know anything. How am I interpreting these lab tests if I don't know something like that? And so what follows from that is, we have a left brain and a right brain, and we should really be thinking about these as like two brains. Like we have two eyes, we have two kidneys, and they're connected, of course. And life is good when they work well together, just like when your two legs work well together, life is good. And when they don't, it's more challenging. And so what often happens as we are developing is that when we are in utero to about the age of 2, the right hemisphere of our brain is preferentially developing. And that's to do a lot with connection and attachment and nonverbal cues and taking it all in. And then around the age of 2.5, the brain development shifts over to the left hemisphere, and we get more verbal, and we say no, and we're individuating, and we're trying to impart our will on our environment, right?
I have 4 young kids, so I've experienced that.
So you know what
Yeah,
I'm talking about,
that's for
right?
sure. Yep.
Yep. And so what can happen is that that the rates of development can be kind of too fast or too slow, leading to certain patterns of problems. So if the right brain doesn't develop enough, or we switch over to the left hemisphere too soon, you end up with certain traits like someone who maybe like a little professor who's reading really early, who's very verbal but maybe is clumsy, and that situation doesn't often self-correct. So what's supposed to happen, as I mentioned before, is the right brain develops and the left brain develops, and then they come together as a coordinated whole. But one of the main functions of the higher levels of the brain is actually to inhibit lower levels of the brain and each other. So if you get one side that's growing kind of faster than peers, you end up with gifts and things where they're kind of better than average at, but also deficits. But then the kind of things down the line of that is, one, they don't have access to a brain that's like talking well together. But also when it comes to chronic illness, this can be a foundational cause, because if you have a right hemisphere dominance that's calming down your immune system, this can lead to lingering chronic infections that you can never get on the top of. So you're kind of always sick, and you're just smoldering. And on the left side, if you have like a very left hemisphere dominant, this is very inflammatory where you can't turn it off. So these are like kind of like, kids that will spike huge fevers or have these huge histamine things, or these conditions that are now being looked at, like PANS and PANDAS, pediatric. There's like this brain inflammation, basically, which
Mhm.
is really heavily associated with a left hemisphere dominance. So that's one big thing where, as I say, it's not a detail, and it's something that, I know that your listeners can follow what I'm saying. It's not rocket science either, but it's very important. And the other thing that goes along with this is that when we are developing in utero and in our first like 6 months to, let's say, a year of life, before our brain is developed and we can do conscious movements, we have these reflexive movements, that brainstem survival movements that are going to allow us to do things like feed from mom's boob and roll over, and call for help if we're scared. And so, as we're developing and our motor systems developing, and our sensory systems developing, then and the brain is developing on top of it, because we develop like a tree, right? So like the
Mhm.
trunk, and it's coming up from the root, and then we crown. So as the brain, the higher brain levels are developing, they're going to come down and inhibit these primitive reflexes. And so what can happen is that process doesn't happen. So you will find children and adults who still have retained primitive reflexes and may not be aware of it. And there's an increasing awareness of retained primitive reflexes when we're talking about kids with sensory issues. We need to be looking at all kids. The studies are showing that nowadays, in classrooms of 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds in like a healthy population, almost all of them have some retained primitive reflexes, and that's directly associated with behavior and skill acquisition. But also for adults, you may have had a very successful life and done all the things that you wanted to do. And, I know business owners, people who are married, who have kids. It's not some sort of intellectual disability, but you may have retained primitive reflexes that are at, an unacknowledged or unexplored root of chronic health issues. And it's not going to matter how much vitamin D you take or like how mold-free your diet, your environment is, or what your diet is, because that development is not going to uh, self-correct on its own. It needs to be addressed. And so I feel passionately that everyone should be assessed for it because it has everything to do with adult health, with healthy aging. And it's a non-invasive exam. It takes less than 10 minutes. And for people who are chronically ill and they're kind of going crazy, looking everywhere for answers, it's not to say that this is the cause of everyone's problem by any stretch of imagination, but to me, it's like a foundational question to ask and assessment to do to see where you're at and to address when appropriate.
So you're looking for these primitive reflexes, and what are some of those reflexes that you're looking at?
Yeah, sure. So, one that's a big one. That's a big quality of life alter. Something called the Moro reflex, and that's an infantile startle reflex. So that develops in utero, and then it should integrate at like 4 months. But if you have a retained Moro, so to explain the difference, if you're like kind of developed in a really strong, great way, and if someone opened the door right now, I would just kind of calmly look around because I live in a safe neighborhood.
Hmm.
It's probably not going to be a threat. So I'm just going to be alert and respond. But if you have a retained Moro reflex, you don't have that option. And you're like, it's like
Mm.
adrenaline dump. And you might be able to recover, you might be able to hide it, but it's not under conscious control. So if you're going through life, we on your show, you talk a lot about modern stresses. It's really important to be aware of them, but also, and resiliency, right? But it's a difference. If you have a retained Moro, it's not, you cannot help if a loud noise causes an adrenaline dump
Mm.
versus for you to go, oh, like, what was that noise? So that's one of them. But another one would be that's very commonly retained something called the asymmetric tonic neck reflex, which is a bit of a mouthful. But this is one that it helps us during the birthing process. So we're going to like turn our head and move our arms, but it's also going to help us roll over. It's also helping to train our close-up vision. But when that's retained, it means that like when you move your head, this brainstem reflex is firing that shouldn't firing. So it's very hard to have a healthy neck and shoulders as an adult if that's firing when you move. And again, it doesn't matter how many Pilates classes you go to or how good you try to have your posture because it's not under conscious control. And having those motor patterns firing as an adult isn't consistent with optimal musculoskeletal health.
Mm. Yeah, so those are some interesting things. So having people, you like to assess people's reflexes to see if they are still in a primitive state or if they've um, basically matured over time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's an objective, non-invasive window into
Hmm.
brain function. So,
Mm.
if you test an adult and they have these, and there's a number of reasons why. One is that they've never gone away. Another is that they've had a head injury. So that's called a frontal release
Right.
sign. So if I damage this part of my brain that's inhibiting them, it's no longer inhibiting them.
Mm.
So that's a good assessment that people should have post concussion. And then the third possibility is that either that they're older or they have like neurodegeneration, and so that front part of their
Mhm.
brain is now getting smaller. So it's not to say that as all 100% of times an adult has it, but what I can say is that it's never normal for an adult to have it, right?
Yeah.
You don't want that finding there. And it's again, it's a non-invasive objective window into brain function, which is great because it's going to tell you things that if I see people who've had really fancy scans and all sorts of things and not assessed this, and it's the exam, it's doable. I teach people how to have their non-medical partners do this exam on them and record it, and it's life-changing information, and it's addressable.
Yeah. Is the gag reflex associated with that as well, or
Um, the
some
gag
people have a
reflex is
really some people have a
associated.
really strong gag reflex. Other people's have a lesser existent gag reflex.
Yeah, 100%. So, by the time that I was assessed, actually, I had no gag reflex, which is
Mm.
kind of showing how where I was functioning
Yeah.
neurologically, which wasn't great. The gag reflex is not a primitive reflex. It's one that you want to continue throughout life. So it is helpful that if something
Sure.
weird is in the back of your throat and it's not food and it's not going down, you want to get rid of that. But that's another sort of related area, which isn't so much specifically about development, but more about neurology in general, which is looking at your cranial nerves. And that's kind of how I segued where I became aware of the importance of brain development and integrating retained primitive reflexes. And then I was like, well, now what? I still had a gap to where I still didn't have great energy. I still was having weird visual issues. So then the next phase was looking at functional neurology. And this was an approach that was really developed a lot to work with athletes rather than primarily sick people. But something like, looking at a gag reflex, again, this is non-invasive. This is not rocket science. This is, everyone, can learn how their body works. And I like, for example, I don't know how cars work. So like if I drop my truck off to be looked at, like I'm at the mercy of the mechanic. But I don't think anyone should have that attitude when it comes to their own body. I think we should really learn a bit about how it works. So looking at a gag reflex, even looking at your tongue strength left and right, or your sensation on your face left and right, all sorts of things that we don't want to over focus on any one detail, but if you learn how to put it together, you can do really high leverage things to change the trajectory of your health. And understanding a bit about I think the nervous system to me is a foundational system, and it's one that is still, from my perspective, just too specialized. So either people maybe who have a neurological diagnosis like Parkinson's or MS or head injury or neurodevelopmental diagnosis may be starting increasingly to see certain people. But then if you come to someone who has autoimmunity, chronic fatigue, Lyme, mold, brain fog, they may go through this gauntlet of practitioners and never have their brain and neurological health assessed and addressed, which to me, it is really upstream of all of the lab tests, of all of the hormone levels, of all of these things. And I'm not going to kind of make the same mistake and say it's only the brain. It's not, but it's a really high leverage and important place to look at and not skip for overall health, whether you're sick and want to get better or you're well and want to perform much better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with the gag reflex, that's very much associated with the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, that travels from the brainstem down, into all our major visceral regions, our heart, digestive system, into our palate and our throat. And so that gag reflex can give an indication of what's happening with the vagus. And I know that that's one of the things you really look at, the vagal paradox. Can you explain that in more detail?
Sure. So the vagus nerve is getting increasing attention, which is great. So, like you just explained, it's a nerve that comes out of our brainstem and kind of goes like almost everywhere through all of our organs. So it is important, and so it definitely wants to get that deserved attention. There are certain distinctions that are being missed, though, where it's getting a little oversimplified. So, um, I'll explain a couple of those. So one is that people are increasingly familiar that we have this fight or flight nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system that helps us run away from the tiger, and the parasympathetic rest and digest, right? And that's mediated, 75% is coming from the vagus nerve. But we actually have two starting points for that vagus nerve, right? So if we look at evolution, which is very helpful because it tells us about development, and when we get sick, we kind of evolve in reverse and we develop in reverse. So it's a useful map. The what was called the dorsal vagus nerve, which is coming from the back part, developed first. So the first thing that we could do as animals when we were under threat was stay very still and like use less oxygen and just hope that nobody noticed us. Then we developed a sympathetic nervous system that would allow us to run away or fight. And then we developed what's called the ventral vagal system that would allow us to maybe like make jokes and or find help from community. So it's a more socially mediated mammalian, more recently evolved part of the vagus nerve. So one really important distinction, this vagal paradox, which was first discovered by a researcher, doctor named Stephen Porges, what led to him creating the polyvagal theory. So poly just means many, vagal, vagus, right? Is that when we are more relaxed in parasympathetic, our heart becomes more responsive to what's going on, and especially when with our breathing. And this is measured with something called heart rate variability, which a lot of people are increasingly looking at on their wearables and getting interested in. And so it's the part of the nervous system that allows us to slow down, especially from stress. But we can also, if we need to slow down and it's an emergency, we can also slam on the brake. And that's like a very different way to slow down. That will also raise your heart rate variability. So that's the vagal paradox. He discovered this when he was looking at neonates, so like newly born babies who were in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. And what he found was that he was measuring heart rate variability, on like a ticker tape with like these huge machines in the 1960s. And as the infants were kind of their situation was worsening and they were going down the development ladder, at a certain point when they were kind of in a very dangerous territory, their heart rate variability would go up, which was paradoxical. And that's how he came to realize and discover and eventually really demonstrate very thoroughly that that was coming from this more primitive dorsal vagal contribution, which is basically like our last option is just to sit here and do nothing and like lower our heart rate and our respiration and hope for the best, which is completely the opposite of thriving and being calm and connected. And so this is really important because well, first of all, I think it's just important for really understanding what we're talking about, that we don't have two levers, we have three levers. And also that a lot of people who are chronically ill fall into this category of not being too inflamed, but rather not being inflamed enough. And they may be in a dorsal vagal shutdown, and their doctors and practitioners are telling them that they're nice and relaxed and their blood pressure is nice and low, and their heart rate is nice and low, and they're just getting completely missed. And it's because the model just needs to zoom out a little bit to account for reality, because it's not just one or two exceptions. This is, I would say, as a rough estimate for chronically ill people, this is probably about 30% of them. So it's not an insignificant perspective, but these are the ones who do not get better for following the blanket advice. They often can feel worse.
Yeah, a lot of times these individuals have exercise intolerance. They really can't exercise, thyroid shutdown, like they're cold all the time. They have no energy, can't get out of bed, a lot of these types of issues. So this is going to be, they're kind of stuck in this dorsal vagal tone, basically, where it's more freeze, immobilization, and that's kind of their stress response.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a distinction as well between freeze and faint. So, I where we live, we have lots of deer, and our dog likes to
Hmm.
chase them, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so, if you have a deer that freezes, they're going to have a high level of sympathetic, so their heart's going
Hmm.
to be racing, and they're going to have that vagal brake applied, so they're completely still, heart racing, completely still. So high sympathetic, high dorsal, versus a fainting goat, which I don't know if you've come across these. I think,
Hmm.
I don't know. I think they're funny. That when they get stressed, they faint, right?
Hmm.
And that does not have high sympathetic tone, that has low sympathetic tone. And
Right.
so again, I think it's wonderful what's happening in general with humans and in health, that we're really exploring these things. And I just think that these distinctions are important. And another aspect about it, going back to first principles, is this idea that we have cycles, right? Daily cycles, we have an annual cycles. And so our metabolism and our physiology change in summer and winter. And inflammation is actually like a big amplitude of normal, regular, healthy summer metabolism. And what we're talking about here with the dorsal vagal shutdown response, where you're cold and your thyroid shut down and all of this, is like big winter. That, one stress response is to run away and have anxiety and turn red and all this stuff. And another response to anxiety, or sorry, to stress, like let's say there's not enough food or whatever it is, your brain might decide, okay, well, we're just going to go into hibernation mode and just wait until things get better. And that's a really risky strategy. It's you're in a better situation objectively, all things being equal, if you are able to run away from your response versus turn into a rock. And it takes usually longer to get better from there. Where, as I say, like it took me like kind of 7 years figuring out what I needed to do in what order, because it's a little bit simpler if you're inflamed to become uninflamed versus if you've shut down to kind of reboot, which often involves becoming inflamed in the process. Because now you have to deal with all the stuff that you hadn't dealt with, and then come out on the other side.
Yeah, so to summarize that, we want to have really good balance between our sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic should be activated when we're exercising, when we're performing or doing something with, it's more intense. But for the most part, throughout the day, we should be more in that rest, digest, kind of higher parasympathetic tone. If we're stuck in that higher sympathetic fight or flight response for a long time, we can revert our parasympathetic response into this dorsal motor pathway and lose that ventral pathway to where we'll be frozen, immobile in a sense, and not able to really engage effectively in life. And so, what are some of the things? What are some of the ways that you look at this? Are you looking at blood pressure? Are you looking at like orthostatic blood pressure when people are sitting and standing? Are you looking at pupils? How are you assessing this?
Yeah, totally. You can get a lot from a good history as a starting point. And one thing I'll mention is there's increasing amount of information understood about the role of early childhood
Mm,
stressors and traumas on
yeah.
adult health. And um, the more they measure this with something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Event Score. And the more ACEs you have, actually, the more likely you are to be in a sort of metabolic shutdown, which is interesting. And I want to be clear, you can still be a functional person. Like you can be in this shutdown stage and still be able to drive your kids to school and work. It's just hard and it's not pleasant and
Yeah.
you'll have other signs that things are, but I don't, you may be in bed, either way, but I want to be clear that it doesn't necessarily, these are survival modes. Um, but so the history is one I like love your suggestion of an orthostatic test because it's dynamic. It's telling you how you respond to a change in posture, which if we're going to evolution and development, is actually one of the biggest distinctions between being an adult animal and the human and like everyone else is that we walk on two legs, right? So other animals don't do that and babies don't do that. So if we are struggling to adjust from sitting to standing, then again, that's a good window into how is your system compensating? And that was one of the issues that I had. I had something called orthostatic hypotension. So whenever I would stand up, my blood pressure would crash. And again, that's gonna like that puts me into a different category of what I'm going to do clinically versus someone who stands up and their heart rate skyrockets and they have POTS, that sort of thing.
Yeah. What should normally happen when if you were to take somebody's blood pressure sitting down and they go ahead and they stand up, you take it again. What should the normal response be?
It should go up slightly.
Go up
So
slightly, like 5 beats, maybe up to 5 beats, three,
uh,
two or three.
pressure. Yeah, something like that. Something like that. So basically, we don't think about what a miracle it is that we
Yeah.
we can do that, which is great. There's enough to think about besides that. But ultimately, if you're sitting, in order to stand up and keep your brain perfused, you have to completely change gears. So it should go up slightly. If it's going up a lot, that's a problem. If it's not going up, that's a problem. If it's going down, that's a problem.
Oh yeah, I confused heart rate and I said beats. But heart rate should go up slightly, and also blood pressure should go up slightly in order to drive more blood from our feet, basically up into our brain because we're going against more gravity that way.
Right.
And so that should be the normal response. But there are a lot of people where what happens in somebody that is in that stuck in that dorsal vagal tone? What happens there?
Yeah. So when you're in a dorsal vagal tone, and this is related to being in a hibernation state, so we can think about this, right, with first principles. So hibernation, what's the posture for that? It's lying down. And so your physiology is optimized for lying down, and everything's and that's where the fatigue comes from. It's trying to modify your behavior to get you to lie down. That's exactly what happens. And the other distinction that I realized relatively recently that I think is super important and one of the most overlooked causes of a lot of these issues perpetuating despite changes in diet and nutrient supplementation and trying to heal a leaky gut and all of these things is something called sensory mismatch, which can also lead. It's a main cause of these blood pressure issues, which is to say that in order to move well through the world, we have certain systems that need to be uh, working well together to kind of create our reality. So we have our visual system, our vestibular system, which is telling us about where we are in gravity, and our body. And what can happen very, very commonly is that the vestibular system, maybe it's like a little bit off. So maybe, between left and right, it's like not quite calibrated. And so it's telling something different, a different story about our movement than our eyes. So this is called sensory mismatch. The brain does not like that because that feels unsafe. Like we're not doing a good job of predicting our environment. And so when that gets bad enough, then it will create these behavior modification symptoms like fatigue, pain, vertigo, anxiety, and things like that to basically get you to lie down because it really does not want you to fall because it's like dangerous. Your brain can hit the ground and all these things. And another thing that contributes to sensory mismatch is problems with interoception, which is your ability to sense your own body's state, which is one of the big contributions of the vagus nerve. So if that's going wonky and we're not gagging and that's all offline because we've been inflamed so long and all of these things, then the body basically is like, I feel like you'd be safer lying down right now. I don't know. And so again, this is like another really overlooked issue, but that will definitely affect how well or poorly we adjust our blood pressure to going sitting to standing, because maybe I go from sitting to standing, and probably what was happening with me when I had this issue, my eyes are telling me one thing and my vestibular system is telling me something else, and it's not doing a good job of fine tuning the all the things that need to change for me to keep my blood pressure up or raise my blood pressure when I stand up. And this is super, super common in people who are having these ongoing health challenges.
Yeah, really good to know. So looking at overall vagal tone, really important. Obviously, you start by looking at, that assessment, Chinese medicine type assessment of the body and looking at health history and applying all of that. Now, are you also using labs when you're looking at patients?
Yeah, so I went very deep into lab testing. I did a master's degree in functional medicine. I've always been interested in biochemistry, and I kind of have a long sort of family lineage of doctors and chemists. And when my system crashed, I went in that direction, and I did more and more training and more labs, and doing these really long panels and looking a lot in PubMed. And I thought I could kind of decode the whole thing. And I got to the end of the rainbow and the gold wasn't there. I realized I had to come back out. So I went from running with, I think reasonably common in many functional medicine practices, which is doing kind of lab-based supplementation, um, to really getting very, very good at this clinical observation and teaching patients how to do it themselves. And the labs are supplementary. So people who do my program do not have to run additional labs. They often have labs that I can help them interpret. And the other thing is that the deeper I got into lab testing, the more I realized that there are problems with lab testing and how they are interpreted, and they're layered and they are many to the point where it's like it's actually a big crisis that they are not saying what a lot of people, very well-meaning and intelligent, believe that they should be saying, to the point that I'm really relieved and grateful that I can guide people this way. And occasionally lab tests will be very useful, but it's always held at arm's length.
Yeah, it's good to know. You can't really base everything on labs. Labs are just one way that, one tool in the tool bag of looking at what's happening in somebody's body. When you when you do run labs or look at labs, what are some of the biomarkers you like to look at?
Um, well, a couple of things. I mean, one is you know, I'll give you an example of a recent one where I said maybe this would be a good idea is, someone who was going through this step-by-step process, making a lot of progress with a lot of things. When I looked at her tongue, it was still coded, and she changed her diet. She was, going through these steps, and it's like I say, her energy had improved and her digestion improved and so on, but digestion was still a little bit off. And I was like, you look like you're being re-exposed to something. Let's talk about mold. Have you had your house assessed for mold? Your car, your workplace, that sort of thing. This might be useful. And so she ran a urinary mold test and found that she was positive. So now that directs our focus and attention to identifying the source of that, because the tools that we were using would have cleared it already if the exposure was in the past. And so that was useful information. In terms of markers, I like them if they are helpful for the patient. So, for example, because I treat a lot of practitioners as well, and so one came in and her primary goal was to improve her thyroid markers, right? And in the past, I had all these like thyroid support supplement, thyroid focus stuff. We just had the lab over there. I said, great. And we just went through the process, looking at things in terms of hot and cold, damp and dry, that sort of thing. And I'm like, great, retest it, see where it's at. And it was perfect, you know? So that was very useful because it's important for the patient's own confidence, that it feels risky to ignore things altogether. But we see these things self-correct. And it's not that I'm not saying that you never address what you see, but if we can do the kind of basic broad strokes 80% first and see what resolves on its own, then if it hadn't resolved after a few good tries, then we could get a little bit more detailed. But like that's one of my kind of rules of thumb is that that looking at things in that detailed reductionist way, it needs to be earned. We need to look at the big picture and address that thoroughly. And if that's not sufficient, then we can look at it reductionistically. But I find that that's very rarely necessary.
Yeah, sure. That makes a lot of sense. Now, what are some of the key health strategies that you see move the needle for a lot of people?
The main thing, honestly, because most of the people I work with at this point have been around the block quite a few times.
Hmm.
So the main differentiator is really learning how to organize tools into a sensible order of operations and go step by step. So I'm a bit like the general contractor. So I'm not like, oh, you know what you need a new roof. Like because some people do and some people don't. But I can tell you that you want to look at your roof first before you start replacing the carpet because if you have a leaky roof then that's just you're going out of order. So we're going to ask everyone about their roof first, and if you don't have any problems then great, proceed. But most people in my program, with this metaphor, do because they have chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and Lyme and and mold and all the things. So we kind of already know that. So the main thing is teaching people how to organize their inputs, how to go in a step-by-step process, and evaluate things rather than any specific supplement or herb or gadget or modality. And it's revolutionary because it helps people understand. Let's say they tried something that they had heard a lot of really great things about, and they're like, this made me worse. But if they can understand exactly why that might have been going out of order, for example, if someone has fibromyalgia like symptoms and they've got like a chronic Lyme infection, your body is really trying to like lower its circulation because it doesn't want it to spread. It's trying to sequester it in its tissues. Now let's say you go for a massage, right? That which makes sense. That should feel good. And then after the massage, you get this huge flare and you feel like hungover and you can't move. And you're like, what did I do wrong? Why? Well, it's because you basically your body was trying to do one thing and remove things from circulation. You went for the massage, which is totally reasonable and understandable. And now you've released all this stuff into circulation and now you're having to deal with it and you're feeling worse. So the answer there is about order of operation, that massage might be helpful for you later. And you can test that. And so that's what is really, it's not one thing that's changed the needle. It's looking at things differently and looking at processes rather than inputs and tools.
Yeah, that's great. And so you work with people with all different types of complex chronic illnesses, and they can find you at synthesishealth.co. So just synthesishealth, all one word, .co. And how does somebody go about working with you or working with one of your programs?
Yeah, so we have a group. It's funny, a lot of people think they don't want a group, and then once people come in, they realize that how helpful and important the group was. And I'm kind of one of those people too. I considered myself an introvert, and I'm like, I don't, but it is really helpful. So you can come into the group as you can apply to be a free guest. I read all the applications and just check that you're kind of a good match for the group, and then you can come in, and you're in a group with current members who are actually going through the program, and you can see how I address their questions, address setbacks because those happen, and things that come up. And you can ask me any questions in that time. And there's also, you get access to like a whole lot of material kind of explaining this way of thinking. It's just a bit of a different way of thinking. And then after that time, after, usually 2 or 3 weeks, people have a pretty, or sooner, people have a pretty good idea if they want to commit to a longer term process. And then they can apply to be an annual member.
Okay, great. And you're doing like weekly calls with them. What are some of the perks of being a member?
perks of being a member. It's actually all asynchronous. So basically, so in the group, you ask me any questions, you'll get a pretty speedy response. And back when I was doing functional medicine one-to-one, it's like if you had a question between appointments, unless it was something really quick, you would just have to wait months to ask the question. So that's the big thing. You get access to all the program material. It's all pre-recorded. A lot of people have brain fog and memory issues.
Yeah.
So it's a really helpful thing. And when people ask, I'm committed to growing with my clients. So, if people get to a certain stage and then they have a question, the program grows with them. And then, just access to tools that I have found helpful. I have a little store where people can get discounts, but it's important to me to not be tied into any specific tool or brand. It's more about helping people to evaluate what's going to be useful for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So they can find out about your group coaching plans. Just go to synthesishealth.co so you can learn more about Mel and her group coaching programs. And looks like you're doing great work, Mel. And this is really fascinating, and I enjoyed the conversation. Any last words of inspiration here for our audience?
Um, just, it's similar to the message that you tell your audience, which is really that, we are designed to heal, and you can get better. And there's so much, there are times when we need, let's say, like kind of expert intervention, but most of the time, if we learn the principles and you learn how your body works and what to do, you really can you should feel empowered to be able to take over, take care of your own health, learn how to grow your own health as a skill, and live a really great life. I think people who listen to your materials, feel that way. And so it's really about giving people the framework so that they can really make that work.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Mel. Guys, check out our website, synthesishealth.co, and we'll see you on a future show. Be blessed.